There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. That's the line, a mysterious whisper hidden among the opening verses of Genesis 6. Few notice it, fewer still understand it, but what it reveals could change everything about how we see the spiritual realm and the battle we're still fighting today. They walked among men. They were strong, feared, and deeply corrupted. They were called the Nephilim. And for centuries their name was spoken in fear, carefully avoided, and often forgotten. Why does the Bible mention them so cryptically? Who were these beings born of the sons of God and the daughters of men? And why, immediately after their appearance, does the earth plunge into a darkness so deep that it forces the Creator to act with the greatest judgment in all of history? This isn't just some ancient tale. It's a biblical mystery with profound echoes, crossing generations, challenging theologians, scholars, and men of faith to this very day. Because if the Nephilim truly existed, what exactly were they? Fallen angels? Spiritual hybrids? Twisted legends rooted in real events? And beyond that, did they leave traces behind? Were their descendants among the nations Israel was commanded to confront? And more disturbing still, could the Nephilim be connected to Jesus' own words about the end of days? The Bible never wastes words, and when it speaks of giants on the earth, there's a spiritual warning buried in that line, a sign that the world was straying from something pure, that unseen forces had crossed boundaries God Himself had set. Those early verses in Genesis aren't just an introduction to the flood. They're a window into a spiritual fall, one that began in the heavens but dragged the earth down with it. Mysteries like this weren't written to entertain. They were left as warnings, because everything that happened back then still echoes today. And to truly grasp the depth of this enigma, to feel the weight of what the Nephilim really were, we must go back to the beginning, before the waters, before the ark, before the destruction, when heaven was still open and the sons of God chose to descend. But to understand who they were, we must return to the moment the world began to rot from within, and heaven let fall its guardians. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. This marks the beginning of one of the most obscure and unsettling passages in the entire Bible. Genesis 6:1-4 isn't there by accident. It is a hidden key, a sign that invisible forces had crossed heaven's boundaries to touch the world of men. But who were these sons of God? And why did their union with human women produce such a strange and terrifying offspring that the very earth trembled under the weight of corruption? The oldest Hebrew tradition and the earliest Christians, long before modern theology softened the extremes, never hesitated to affirm these sons of God were angels, spiritual beings, created by God to guard, not to possess. But they fell. They descended, took human wives for themselves, and begat giants. Nephilim, that is the name given to these beings, born of a union that should never have existed. They weren't just physically massive, they were a spiritual distortion, an impure fruit, a sign that the earth was being corrupted from within. Violence increased, wickedness spread like a plague, creation, wounded at its core, began to bleed, and God watched. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not always strive with man." The Nephilim were more than strange creatures. They were a sign that the line between the spiritual and the earthly had been broken. This passage doesn't merely precede the flood, it reveals the deeper reason why the flood came. The earth was filled with blood, but more than that, it was filled with a presence that didn't belong. According to ancient writings like the Book of Enoch, these spiritual beings were called the Watchers, angels sent to observe, but who chose to desire. They descended, took wives, and taught humanity things it was never meant to know: spells, weapons, enchantments, dominion over matter and over death. The Bible doesn't delve into these details. Because the Bible isn't driven by curiosity, it offers us something greater, discernment. And it makes one thing clear: there was a generation corrupted by something beyond flesh, by something that fell from the heavens and touched the earth. Today, many dismiss this as allegory. Others try to rationalize it, but the truth is there in the text. What happened was a blending, an invasion, and an impure offspring called the Nephilim, creatures born of spiritual rebellion, a sign that the world was falling apart, not because of war, but because it had lost its connection to God. And when the earth loses its bond with the Creator, even the heavens fall silent for a time. Yet still, God saw and He felt. If this forgotten truth of the Word is stirring something in your heart, the secrets of the Bible can no longer remain silent. Like this video, share it and subscribe to the channel, because when truth is silenced, darkness advances, and together we can keep the light of revelation alive. The story of the Nephilim is no biblical footnote. It is the dark reflection of what happens when the boundary between the sacred and the profane is violated, and the result came swiftly, radically, unavoidably. And the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Judgment didn't come out of nowhere. It was provoked, sown by those who held power and used that power to corrupt. And it is in this moment, with the earth spiritually deformed, that God makes a definitive decision. But before the waters covered the land, there was a silent pause, a divine breath. One man still walked in righteousness, while the rest of the world was already submerged in darkness. And the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. These words are not merely an ancient record. They are the Creator's lament over a creation that chose to break away from Him. But why had wickedness multiplied so rapidly? What had become of the men who were made in the image of God? The answer was already written a few verses earlier. The Nephilim had entered history, and with them came a spiritual distortion like the world had never seen. The earth was already violent, but now it had become something else: an invaded land, a tainted soil, ground pulsing with blood, and with the weight of a fall that wasn't just human. Genesis 6 paints a desperate scene. No innocence, no pause. Every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This was no longer just sin. It was a structural corruption. When the sons of God took the daughters of men for themselves, something was broken, and God saw it. He saw creation being torn apart from within, and He decided it was time to begin again. The flood was not a rash punishment. It was a reset, an act of purification in the face of a contamination that could no longer be contained. The very name Nephilim, in its Hebrew root, carries the meaning of fallen. Not just giants of flesh, but beings born from the collapse of heaven meeting earth. And their presence corrupted everything, from the intentions of the heart to the physical bodies and bloodlines of humanity. Noah rises in this moment like a flicker of light, a man righteous and blameless among his generation. But the text reveals more. Noah was perfect in his generations. It wasn't just his behavior. There was something preserved in his lineage, something still intact. While the rest of the world had become mixed, Noah still bore the original trace of God's breath. It was through him that the story could go on. It was around him that mercy took shape in the form of an ark. The ark wasn't only a vessel of physical salvation, it was the symbol of a new covenant, a refuge in the midst of a fall. Heaven wept. The fountains of the deep were broken open, and all that breathed was swept away. But in that silence of water and judgment, there was a hidden purpose: to remove from the earth what was never meant to be. The Nephilim, giants born of rebellion, drowned with the old world, but their story didn't end there, because even after the flood, something remained. Genesis 6 leaves a subtle trail. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, a nearly silent phrase. yet it echoes like thunder to those who seek to understand the Bible's secrets. If God had purified everything, how could the Nephilim reappear? This question finds no direct answer, but it's not forgotten. As Israel moves forward, as spies are sent out and cities fall, giants are seen once more. Were they remnants? Or had the spiritual fall that birthed them found another way to manifest? The mystery endures, and with it, a new layer of biblical tension emerges on the horizon, because the earth, now renewed, would once again face echoes of the past, and God's chosen people would have to confront what Noah never had to. Giants returned. And it's at this point in the narrative, when the traces of the Nephilim reappear among the promised lands, that a new war begins. A war where faith faces not just armies, but ancient shadows, fallen bloodlines that still defy the plan of God. And it was against these presences that a young shepherd, unarmored, stood up in the name of the Lord. But even after the waters covered mountains and erased cities, even after the justice of God swept away everything on earth that had been corrupted, something remained, or returned, or perhaps never truly disappeared. Because the sacred text lets slip a subtle phrase, as brief as it is unsettling. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. This expression tears open a wound in the post-flood silence. If the purpose of judgment was to purify, how do we explain the presence of the Nephilim again? The Bible offers no direct answer, but in its traces there are hints, and in its records of war, conquest, and promise, there are names: Anakim, Emim, Rephaim, feared peoples, men of unnatural stature, enemies of Israel who terrified not just by their size, but by what they represented. An ancient bloodline carrying something dark. When the spies sent by Moses returned from the land of Canaan, their words were not of courage, but fear. We saw the sons of Anak there, descendants of the Nephilim, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. That's no casual metaphor. It's a reminder that the Bible's secrets don't stay buried for long. They resurface, and when they do, they test the faith of men. Moses' generation failed to enter the Promised Land, not because of weakness, but because of overwhelming fear. Fear of giants, fear of ancient echoes. And so the desert received them for 40 years, because the fear of the past still lived within them. The presence of the Nephilim after the flood isn't just a biblical mystery, it's a reminder. The spiritual fall that gave rise to them can stretch across generations, even after judgment. When Joshua finally led Israel into the Promised Land, he encountered entire cities devoted to these people. Hebron, for example, home of the descendants of Anak, giants, survivors of a forgotten lineage. Israel's mission wasn't just to conquer territory, it was to erase memories, to tear down both physical and spiritual strongholds that opposed God's covenant. And yet not all were destroyed. Among the survivors were the Philistines, and among them Gath, a city mentioned often, a name that would echo in a story everyone knows, but few truly understand. Because from Gath came a warrior of invincible stature, wielding weapons too heavy for any ordinary man, so fearsome in appearance that no soldier dared face him: Goliath. He wasn't just an enemy of Israel, he was the final echo of a much older war. Goliath was a descendant of the Rephaim, the surviving giants, and when he stood before the army of God, he challenged more than men. He challenged the memory of a time God had tried to erase. This wasn't just a military confrontation, it was a clash of bloodlines, the lineage of faith against the lineage of corruption. But before we reach that scene, before we hear the stone cut through the air, we must understand what was at stake. Because the Nephilim somehow returned, and wherever they walked, the earth trembled. Their presence was more than physical, it was spiritual, it was symbolic. It was a reminder that evil, when not confronted, returns in new forms. And no promised land can stand when fear outweighs faith. Israel moved forward only when it dared to believe. When they stopped seeing giants and started seeing promises. And that's where David steps in, not merely as a shepherd or a warrior, but as a symbol of what happens when someone dares to rise against what everyone else deems impossible. While the people trembled before the legacy of the Nephilim, a young man, unarmored, chose to trust in the name of the Lord of hosts. He had no armor, no sword, no name among the soldiers, only a sling and the unshakable conviction that God was still God, and that even in the face of a giant, faith should never retreat. David didn't arrive on that battlefield by chance. He was sent by his father to bring food to his brothers. But the true sending came from above, because what was about to unfold was not merely a fight between two men. It was the collision of two bloodlines, the lineage of promise against the final roar of a fallen lineage. Goliath was no ordinary warrior. He was a remnant, a descendant of the Rephaim, the giants named among Israel's enemies. If the Nephilim had left traces after the flood, Goliath was one of them, a living echo of an ancient corruption, a fruit born of something that had once defied the heavens and now defied the people of God. For 40 days he challenged. For 40 days no one answered, until David arrived. And there, at the front lines, the young shepherd saw what others couldn't. It wasn't the size of the enemy that mattered. It was the size of the faith that faced him. While the men trembled at Goliath's height and might, David saw the unseen. He saw the God who had delivered him from the bear and the lion, and who would now deliver him from the giant. Because to David, Goliath wasn't invincible. He was uncircumcised. In other words, outside the covenant, without divine covering, just towering flesh, without eternal spirit. You come to me with sword, spear, and shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. That phrase cut through the silence like a prophecy, and in that moment, the entire spiritual history behind the giants seemed to tremble. David released the stone. But what fell was more than a body. It was the symbol that faith, when anchored in God, can defeat even what seems to come from unbeatable bloodlines. What many saw as merely a military victory was in truth the closing of a spiritual cycle that had begun long before. David didn't just kill a Philistine. He ended the humiliation the Nephilim had long represented. The people of God, who once saw themselves as grasshoppers before giants, now watched them fall before the covenant. And it didn't stop with Goliath. Others came after him. Scripture tells us that David and his mighty men defeated other descendants of the Rephaim, giants with massive spears, extra fingers, and eyes full of defiance. But none of them prevailed, because the faith that began with David revealed that true strength is not in the body, but in the spirit. The war against the Nephilim was no longer physical. It had become symbolic, spiritual, a declaration that no fall, no matter how ancient, is greater than the faithfulness of God. And the boy who faced the last giant would become the king who established the throne of promise. The lineage from which would come the one who would crush once and for all the head of the serpent. Even with Goliath defeated, even with the last giants brought down by the people of God, the presence of the Nephilim was not forgotten. It remained, not in bodies, but in the spiritual cycles of history. And that is precisely what Jesus spoke of when he warned, "As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the coming of the Son of Man." This comparison is no coincidence. It carries a deep spiritual weight. The days of Noah were days of irreversible downfall, of a humanity that crossed the boundary between what is earthly and what is heavenly, of spiritual beings who touched the world of men, and of the generation born from that transgression, the Nephilim. The Bible says that in those days all flesh had been corrupted. Not just actions, but natures. The earth wasn't merely full of violence. It was mixed, altered, disfigured. When Jesus recalls the days of Noah, he is saying the end won't just be difficult, it will be similar, spiritually deformed. Today, we don't see giants like Goliath, but we face other forms of distortion. genetic manipulation, redefinition of human identity, contempt for every boundary established by God, the same essence, in a new form. The Nephilim were the result of a profane union, a crossing between corrupted spirits and seduced humanity. Today, we witness the crossing between arrogance and technology, between artificial wisdom and the absence of reverence, between knowledge and the refusal to submit to the Creator. The biblical mystery of the Nephilim then confronts us once again, not as an ancient curiosity, but as a prophetic mirror. They represent what happens when man seeks to surpass the condition God gave him, when he rejects the image to become his own creator. And perhaps that is why Jesus said, "As it was in the days of Noah," because what came before the judgment is once again standing before us. The Nephilim are not just figures from a distant past. They are a dark mirror, a reflection of what humanity becomes when it abandons its origin and tries to become what it was never meant to be. They were born from mixture, from the desire to cross sacred boundaries, from the union between the eternal and the earthly. And when that boundary is violated, the result is never just physical. It is spiritual, it is moral, it is existential, because the Nephilim represent what happens when man rejects his identity in God, when he no longer wants to be the image of the Creator, but the creator of himself, when he chooses power over obedience. The Bible shows us that every time humanity reaches that point, judgment is not just inevitable, it is necessary. But it also shows us something greater, that God always preserves a lineage, a faith, a remnant. While many seek to become giants, God looks for those willing to remain small, so that through them he can reveal his greatness. This story doesn't end with the Nephilim. It continues through those who, like Noah, like David, choose to stay faithful even when the whole world bows to deception. If this journey has opened your eyes to something greater, if the Nephilim have stopped being just a biblical curiosity and have begun to reveal the true condition of a world rejecting its creator, then it's time to act. Share this video with someone who needs to wake up. Write in the comments what most confronted your soul and leave a like. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and walk with us in this mission to proclaim the secrets of Scripture with truth, courage, and reverence. Because there are moments when silence becomes complicity, and some revelations can no longer be ignored. Truth must be spoken, even when the whole world chooses the giants.